Good afternoon, thank you for joining me, and a happy new year to you all. Hope you had a great festive season, whatever you chose to do. So this week I've decided we all love a good mystery, and some of these are proper head scratchers, which is why I chose them. So let's delve into bizarre true crimes. In 1977, the residents of Circleville, Ohio, began receiving letters threatening to expose some of their darkest secrets. The letters were postmarked from Columbus, Ohio, located just 30 miles away. The writer was anonymous and seemed to know a great deal about Circleville's residents. Once people began receiving these letters, each message became increasingly vicious and threatening. Two residents who began receiving such letters were Mary and Ron Gillespie. The letters Mary received accused her of having an affair with a school superintendent named Gordon Massey. The first letter stated, "Stay away from Massey. Don't lie about him. I know where you live. I've been observing your house and know you have children. This is no joke. Please take it serious. Everyone concerned has been notified, and everything will be over soon." Soon after, Mary's husband Ron received the following statement in his letter. "Mr. Gillespie, your wife is seeing Gordon Massey. You should catch them together and kill them both. He doesn't deserve to live." Townspeople began receiving this type of mail constantly. Many of them were terrified that they were being watched. The situation took a tragic turn when Ron received a call one night in August 1977. Whatever the caller told him enraged him so much, he grabbed a gun and claimed he was going to confront the writer. Ron unfortunately didn't make it anywhere. He was speeding, likely still upset over the situation, and lost control of his truck. He slammed into a tree and was killed. He'd previously received a letter threatening his life, and while his death was ruled accidental, some believe foul play was involved. The letters continued. Mary was then almost killed herself when she stopped to pull an obscene sign mentioning her 13-year-old daughter off a fence. The sign had a box attached to it with a loaded gun inside, ready to go off, effectively a booby trap. The gun was traced back to Paul Freshour, Ron and Mary's brother-in-law. He was quickly arrested and, after failing a polygraph test, convicted of attempted murder. He maintained his innocence during the entire trial and the 10 years he spent in prison. He also vehemently denied being the letter writer, which seemingly proved true. While Freshour was in prison and reportedly didn't have access to pen and paper, the town was still receiving letters, and authorities were no closer to finding the author's identity. Several other residents met tragic ends, as secrets were revealed in the letters they, their family and their friends received. In 1994, after 20 years of tormenting the citizens of Circleville, and soon after Freshour's release from prison, the letters stopped. The messages tore many friends and families apart, but the writer's identity has never been discovered. In 1931, 54-year-old radiology technician Carl Tanzler fell in love with 22-year-old Maria Eleanor Milagro de Hoyos. Tanzler had met Hoyos at the Key West Hospital, where he worked while she was receiving treatment for tuberculosis. Tanzler, who wasn't qualified to treat tuberculosis, claimed he could cure Hoyos, but she succumbed to her illness in October 1931. A grief-stricken Tanzler paid for Hoyos' mausoleum and visited her corpse every night for the following 2 years. In 1933, Tanzler took Hoyos' corpse out of the mausoleum and brought it back to his home, unbeknownst to her family, where he lived with it for 7 years. He kept the body from decomposing by stuffing it with rags and wire hangers, and by covering the body in plaster of Paris. Hoyos' body was eventually removed from the home in 1940, after a neighbourhood boy saw Tanzler dancing with what the boy claimed to be a giant doll. Charges were pressed against Tanzler for grave robbery, but he eventually walked free, as the statute of limitations on his crime had expired. In fact, the media portrayed the ordeal as a romantic story, often mentioning that Tanzler believed he could someday bring Hoyos back to life. In the early 1950s, two New Zealand teenagers named Pauline Parker and Juliet Hume bonded over their shared ill health. The girls had no other friends except one another, and their friendship grew quickly. Unlike most friendships, however, Parker and Hume's relationship turned into obsession. They became codependent on one another, often spending hours creating a fantasy world in which they developed alter egos named Deborah and Gina. They made plans to become actresses and move to Hollywood together, and would often sneak out at night to visit each other and continue their plans. They'd react violently to any suggestion of spending time apart. Soon their parents grew concerned at the intense and delusional nature of the girls' friendship. They suspected the relationship had become sexual. Things came to a head when the girls were faced with the prospect of being separated. Hume's parents were getting divorced, and had decided she would be moving out of the country with her father. The girls pleaded for Parker to come along as well, but both sets of parents refused. Parker and Hume refused to accept this answer, and the end result horrified all of New Zealand. On June the 22nd, 1954, Parker's mother, Honora Parker, took the girls, then aged 15 and 16, out for tea and a walk at Victoria Park. After strolling down a secluded walkway, the girls used a brick to fatally bludgeon Honora. They then ran back to the tea kiosk, covered in blood, claiming Honora fell. Police were suspicious from the start, as Honora's injuries didn't seem to indicate a fall. After discovering Parker's diary, wherein she described her and Hume's murder plans, police arrested both girls. The jury refused to accept their insanity plea, and on August the 28th they were sentenced to indefinite time in separate New Zealand prisons. They only served 5 years. Years later, Parker moved to England, where she changed her name and became a devout Catholic. She also became a children's horse riding instructor. Hume realised her dream of becoming a famous novelist. She used the pseudonym Anne Perry and wrote several novels, fittingly, about murder. In January 1981, a man and woman's remains were found in woods outside of Houston, Texas. There was little evidence left at the scene, and they went unidentified until late 2021, when genealogical researchers tracked down the John Doe's sister. The young couple was then positively identified as Dean and Tina Klaus, who'd recently relocated to Louisville, Texas, from Central Florida. Investigators were surprised when Dean's sister, after learning of her brother's death, asked, "Where's the baby?" At the time of their deaths, Dean and Tina had a baby daughter, Holly, who was less than a year old. No one knew what had become of her. Not long after finding Dean and Tina's identities, investigators began searching for Holly. It didn't take long. In June of 2022, Holly was found alive, living in Oklahoma after she'd been adopted as an infant. While the identity of Dean and Tina's killer is undetermined, as is whether or not their killer or killers was the one to give Holly up for adoption, family members have their suspicions. Dean was reportedly involved with a Jesus People organisation before his death. After he moved to Texas and his letters stopped coming, his mother says the organisation contacted her about returning his car. She met with a group of Jesus People to retrieve the car and ask about her son, but she alleges they told her he'd joined their group and was cutting off ties. Both families tried to report the couple missing, but were told by authorities they probably didn't want to be contacted. Many questions still remain about the case, but Holly has reportedly been in contact with her newfound family members. On a Friday night in late March 1922, a German family and their new maid were murdered at their remote farm. Law enforcement interviewed several suspects in an effort to find the person, or people, responsible for the shocking murders of 6. More than a century later, however, no one has ever been charged with the horrifying killings that occurred at the farm in Hinterkaifeck, a small Bavarian homestead. The Hinterkaifeck murders remain one of Germany's oldest unsolved murders of a family. On April 4th, 1922, Lorenz Schlittenbauer noticed his neighbour's mail stacking up at their farm in rural Hinterkaifeck. Worried something was wrong at the farm, Schlittenbauer recruited fellow neighbours Jacob Sigel and Michael Pohl to help him investigate. Finding the home's front door locked, the men headed to the barn, where they discovered the bodies of Victoria Gabriel, 35, her daughter Kazilia, 7, and Victoria's parents, Andreas Gruber, 64, and Kazilia Gruber, 72. Each family member was killed with multiple blows to the head. The bodies had been stacked on top of each other and covered by a board and some hay. Wanting to investigate the home, the men found a hallway connecting the barn to the main house. Inside, the men found the bodies of the family's 44-year-old maid, Maria Baumgartner, and Victoria's 2-year-old son, Joseph. Both Maria and Joseph had been bludgeoned to death in their beds. Although the murders at the Hinterkaifeck farm weren't discovered until April 4th, police determined the family had all died on the evening of Friday, March 31st. This had been Maria Baumgartner's first day working as the family's maid, and her sister later confirmed everyone was alive when she visited Maria at the farm that afternoon. The following day, 2 coffee salesmen came by the farm, but no one answered the door. However, smoke was coming from the chimney, and someone had seemingly fed the family's livestock. A repairman also arrived at the house on April 4th, but found no one there. The mail piling up, the family missing church on Sunday, and Kazilia not showing up for school all led to the search of the barn and the eventual discovery of the murders. The closest police department to Hinterkaifeck was in Munich, Germany, about 45 miles away. After discovering the bodies, Schlittenbauer and the men alerted their families and fellow neighbours about the gruesome murder scene at the farm. By the time lead investigator George Reingruber arrived from Munich, dozens of people had walked through the crime scene, destroying evidence and, in the process, compromising the police investigation. Despite the tampered crime scene and virtually no forensic testing available at the time, police theorised the killer, or killers, had somehow lured the 4 family members out to the barn one by one to murder them before returning to the home to kill Maria and Joseph. On April 5th, 1922, Dr. Johann Baptist Aumüller conducted autopsies on the victims of the Hinterkaifeck murders. He subsequently determined that they had all died by blunt force trauma to the head, and the weapon was likely a pickaxe or a mattock. Dr. Aumüller also noted there were strangulation marks on the older Kazilia. As for the younger Kazilia, she likely took hours to die trapped beneath her family's bodies. Investigators found Kazilia holding fistfuls of her own hair, and her head had several bald patches. Dr. Aumüller suspected the little girl probably died from a combination of her injuries and shock. In the months and weeks leading up to the killings, a number of strange events occurred at the Hinterkaifeck farm. 6 months prior, the family's previous maid reportedly quit after hearing footsteps in the attic, which made her believe the house was haunted. Neighbours also told police Andreas Gruber found footprints in the snow that began at the woods surrounding the farm and ended at the barn. However, he could find no footprints leading away from the barn. This revelation led to the theory that the killer hid in the barn and perhaps the attic, which some thought accounted for the footsteps the previous maid heard. Andreas also mentioned his keys had gone missing, and he found a newspaper he didn't subscribe to in the home. He declined to borrow a gun from one of his neighbours to protect himself and his family. 7 years before the residents of the Hinterkaifeck farm were murdered, Victoria and Andreas were accused of incest after someone submitted an anonymous report. Both the father and daughter were put on trial and eventually found guilty. Andreas served 1 year in prison, and Victoria served either 1 year or 1 month according to differing reports. Over the course of the investigation and re-investigations into the Hinterkaifeck murders, authorities suspected over 100 people of potentially being the killer or killers. One theory that dominated the early investigation posited Lorenz Schlittenbauer may have killed the family. According to rumours, Lorenz and Victoria had a romantic relationship, and Joseph was allegedly Lorenz's son. Some even claimed Lorenz referred to Joseph as mein Bubel, meaning my boy. Rumours also spread, however, that Lorenz suspected Andreas was actually Joseph's father. Lorenz allegedly went so far as to put forward another complaint of incest, but decided not to at Victoria's behest. In the end, there was no clear way to tie Schlittenbauer to the murders or prove he was Joseph's father, so authorities eliminated him as a suspect. Part of the tension at the Hinterkaifeck farm stems from its ownership. Victoria, not Andreas, owned the farm. She gained ownership after her husband, Karl Gabriel, died in World War I. Some also alleged Karl knew Kazilia was actually Andreas's daughter, which is why he went to live with his parents for several months before going off to war. As far as Karl's death was concerned, his body was never found, leaving some to speculate he had returned to the farm and murdered the family in revenge. Claims also arose that Karl was sighted during World War II, wearing a Soviet Union military uniform. Despite speculation, authorities have never confirmed any of these theories. After autopsies had been completed, the court physician removed the heads of all 6 victims, which he reportedly sent to Munich for further examination. Allegedly, the skulls of the Grubers and their maid were also given to clairvoyants, presumably in an effort to learn more about the perpetrator or perpetrators who committed the massacre. For some reason, the victims' skulls were kept in Munich. Thus, the Gruber family and their maid, Maria Baumgartner, were buried without their heads. According to the authorities, the skulls went missing following the upheaval caused by World War II and were never recovered. In 1999, an elderly woman contacted the authorities, claiming her former landlord admitted to having information about the Hinterkaifeck killings. Officials investigated this tip and learnt the landlord supposedly made this claim in 1935. However, it was too late, as the potential suspect mentioned in the lead was no longer alive. In 2007, more than 80 years after the Gruber family and their maid were killed, students at Fürstenfeldbruck Police Academy used modern techniques to investigate the unsolved case. The students ruled out all but one suspect they believe committed the murders at the Hinterkaifeck farm. However, the suspected killer is dead, so they did not publicly name the person they believed was responsible for the massacre, out of respect for the suspect's living relatives and the victim's memory. Elizabeth Short, known posthumously as the Black Dahlia, was an American woman found murdered in the Leimert Park neighborhood of Los Angeles on January 15, 1947. Her case became highly publicized owing to the gruesome nature of the crime, which included the mutilation of her corpse, which was bisected at the waist. A native of Boston, Short spent her early life in New England and Florida before relocating to California, where her father lived. It is commonly held that Short was an aspiring actress, though she had no known acting credits or jobs during her time in Los Angeles. She would acquire the nickname of the Black Dahlia posthumously, as newspapers of the period often nicknamed particularly lurid crimes. The term may have originated from a film noir murder mystery, The Blue Dahlia, released in 1946. Short's unsolved murder and the details surrounding it have had a lasting cultural intrigue, generating various theories and public speculation. Her life and death have been the basis of numerous books and films, and her murder is frequently cited as one of the most famous unsolved murders in American history, as well as one of the oldest unsolved cases in Los Angeles County. Elizabeth Short was born on July 29, 1924, in the Hyde Park section of Boston, Massachusetts. She was the third of 5 daughters. In 1927, the Short family briefly located to Portland, Maine, before settling in Medford, a suburb of Boston, that same year. Short's father built miniature golf courses until he lost most of his savings in the 1929 stock market crash. In 1930, his car was found abandoned on the Charleston Bridge, and it was assumed that he'd jumped into the Charles River. Believing her husband to be deceased, Short's mother began working as a bookkeeper to support the family, but in late 1942, she received a letter of apology from her presumed deceased husband, which revealed that he was in fact alive and had started a new life in California. In December, at age 18, Short relocated to Vallejo, California, to live with her father, whom she had not seen since she was 6. In July 1946, Short relocated to Los Angeles to visit Army Air Force Lieutenant Joseph Gordon Fickling, an acquaintance from Florida, who was stationed at the Naval Reserve Air Base in Long Beach. Short spent the last 6 months of her life in Southern California, mostly in the Los Angeles area. Shortly before her death, she had been working as a waitress and rented a room behind the Florentine Gardens nightclub on Hollywood Boulevard. She has been variously described and depicted as an aspiring or would-be actress. According to some sources, she did in fact have aspirations to be a film star, though she had no acting jobs or credits. On January 9, 1947, Short returned to her home in Los Angeles after a brief trip to San Diego with Robert Red Manley, a 25-year-old married salesman she'd been dating. Manley stated that he dropped Short off at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles and that Short was to meet her sister, who was visiting from Boston that afternoon. Staff at the Biltmore recalled having seen Short using the lobby telephone. Shortly after, she was allegedly seen by patrons of the Crown Grill Cocktail Lounge at 754 South Olive Street, approximately 600 metres away from the Biltmore. On the morning of January 15, 1947, Short's naked body, severed into 2 pieces, was found on a vacant lot on the west side of South Norton Avenue, midway between Coliseum Street and West 39th Street, in the neighbourhood of Leimert Park. At the time, Leimert Park was largely undeveloped. Local resident Betty Bersinger discovered the body at approximately 10 a.m. while out walking with her 3-year-old daughter, initially thinking she'd found a discarded store mannequin. When she realised it was a corpse, she rushed to a nearby house and telephoned the police. Short's severely mutilated body was completely severed at the waist and drained of blood, leaving her skin a pallid white. Medical examiners determined that she had been dead for around 10 hours prior to the discovery. The body had apparently been washed by the killer. Short's face had been slashed from the corners of her mouth to her ears, creating an effect known as the Glasgow smile. She had several cuts on her thighs and breasts, where entire portions of flesh had been sliced away. The lower half of her body was positioned a foot away from the upper, and her intestines had been tucked neatly beneath her buttocks. The corpse had been posed, with her hands over her head, her elbows bent at right angles, and her legs spread apart. An autopsy of Short's body was performed on January 16, 1947, by Frederick Newbar, the Los Angeles County coroner. Newbar's autopsy report stated that Short was 5 feet 5 inches tall, weighed 115 pounds, and had light blue eyes, brown hair, and badly decayed teeth. There were ligature marks on her ankles, wrists, and neck, and an irregular laceration with superficial tissue loss on her right breast. Newbar also noted superficial lacerations on the right forearm, left upper arm, and the left lower side of the chest. The body had been cut completely in half by a technique taught in the 1930s called a hemicorporectomy. The lower half of her body had been removed by transecting the lumbar spine between the second and third lumbar vertebrae, thus severing the intestines at the duodenum. Newbar's report noted very little bruising along the incision line, suggesting it had been performed after death. Another gaping laceration measuring 4 1/4 inches in length ran longitudinally from the umbilicus to the suprapubic region. The lacerations on each side of the face, which extended from the corners of the lips, were measured at 3 inches on the right side of the face and 2.5 inches on the left. The skull was not fractured, but there was bruising noted on the front and right side of her scalp, with a small amount of bleeding in the subarachnoid space on the right side, consistent with blows to the head. The cause of death was determined to be hemorrhaging from the lacerations to her face and the shock from blows to the head and face. Short was identified after her fingerprints were sent to the FBI via sound photo, a device which transmitted images by telephone and was normally used for news photographs. Short's fingerprints were on file from her 1943 arrest for underage drinking. On January 21, 1947, a person claiming to be Short's killer placed a phone call to the office of James Richardson, the editor of The Examiner. congratulating Richardson on the newspaper's coverage of the case and stating that he planned on eventually turning himself in, but not before allowing police to pursue him further. Additionally, the caller told Richardson to expect some souvenirs of Beth Short in the mail. On January the 24th, a suspicious manila envelope was discovered by a US Postal Service worker. The envelope had been addressed to the Los Angeles Examiner and other Los Angeles papers, with individual words that had been cut and pasted from newspaper clippings. Additionally, a large message on the face of the envelope read, "Here is Dahlia's belongings, letter to follow." The envelope contained Short's birth certificate, business cards, photographs, names written on pieces of paper, and an address book with the name Mark Hansen embossed on the cover. The packet had been carefully cleaned with gasoline, similarly to Short's body, which led police to suspect the packet had been sent directly by the killer. Despite the efforts to clean the packet, several partial fingerprints were lifted from the envelope and sent to the FBI for testing. However, the prints were compromised in transit and thus could not be properly analysed. The same day the packet was received by the Examiner, a handbag and a black suede shoe were reported to have been seen on top of a garbage can in an alley a short distance from Norton Avenue, 2 miles from where Short's body had been discovered. The pile of clothing was first seen by a beach caretaker, who reported the discovery to John Dillon, lifeguard captain. Dillon immediately notified Captain Christensen of West Los Angeles Police Station. The clothes included a coat and trousers of blue herringbone tweed, a brown and white t-shirt, white jockey shorts, tan socks and tan moccasin leisure shoes. The clothes gave no clue about the identity of their owner. Police quickly deemed Mark Hansen, the owner of the address book found in the packet, a suspect. Hansen was a wealthy local nightclub and theatre owner and an acquaintance at whose home Short had stayed with friends, and according to some sources, he also confirmed that the person's shoe discovered in the alley were in fact Short's. Ann Toth, Short's friend and roommate, told investigators that Short had recently rejected sexual advances from Hansen and suggested it as a potential cause for him to kill her. However, he was cleared of suspicion in the case. In addition to Hansen, the Los Angeles Police Department interviewed over 150 men in the ensuing weeks, whom they believed to be potential suspects. Red Manley, who had been one of the last people to see Short alive, was also investigated, but was cleared of suspicion after passing numerous polygraph examinations. Police also interviewed several persons found listed in Hansen's address book, including Martin Lewis, who had been an acquaintance of Short's. Lewis was able to provide an alibi for the date of Short's murder, as he was in Portland, Oregon, visiting his father-in-law who was dying of kidney failure. On January the 26th, another letter was received by the Examiner, this time handwritten, which read, "Here it is. Turning in wed. January 29th, 10 a.m. Had my fun at police. Black Dahlia Avenger." The letter also named a location at which the supposed killer would turn himself in. Police waited at the location on the morning of January the 29th, but the alleged killer did not appear. Instead, at 1 p.m, the Examiner officers received another cut and pasted letter, which read, "Have changed my mind. He would not give me a square deal. Dahlia killing was justified." The graphic nature of the crime and the subsequent letters received by the Examiner had resulted in a media frenzy surrounding Short's murder. Both local and national publications covered the story heavily, many of which reprinted sensationalistic reports suggesting that Short had been tortured for hours prior to her death. The information, however, was false, yet police allowed the reports to circulate so as to conceal Short's true cause of death, cerebral hemorrhage, from the public. Further reports about Short's personal life were publicised, including details about her alleged declining of Hansen's romantic advances. Additionally, a stripper who was an acquaintance of Short's told police that she liked to get guys worked up over her, but she'd leave them hanging dry. This led some reporters and detectives to look into the possibility that Short was a lesbian and begin questioning employees and patrons of gay bars in Los Angeles. This claim, however, remained unsubstantiated. The notoriety of Short's murder has spurred a large number of confessions over the years, many of which have been deemed false. During the initial investigation into her murder, police received a total of 60 confessions, most made by men. Since that time, over 500 people have confessed to the crime, some of whom had not even been born at the time of her death. Despite all the investigations over the years, Elizabeth Short's murderer was never found. She's interred at the Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland. After her younger sisters had grown up and married, their mother Phoebe moved to Oakland to be near her daughter's grave. Short's murder has been described as one of the most brutal and culturally enduring crimes in American history, and Time magazine listed it as one of the most infamous unsolved cases in the world. And that brings this week's video to a close. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate it. So I shall be back here next Sunday, 4 p.m. as usual, GMT. So I hope to see you then. Have a safe week and don't forget, stay spooky.